紫外线机器消毒装置呢，我想首先要说的是，这30年紫外线的发展非常快，我们已经不能用老眼光去看它了。这种222纳米的紫外线灯呢，确实对人的安全性是极大地增强了，所以这也是我们值得关注的。
22纳米波现在的研究证据显示，它能够灭菌消毒起到灭菌消毒作用的同时，而不对人体产生伤害，是可用于有人的场景的这是一个突破性的一个进展
就是目前的研究证据证明了支持了22纳米波消毒的一个有效性。第二个就是目前基于皮肤实验、动物实验、模拟实验和人体实验的研究结果，也支持了22纳米波对人体无害的一个研究结论。
22纳米呢，由于它对皮肤对这个眼黏膜是没有刺激，所以可以在这个有人的情况下进行空气消毒。
按照相关的标准团标是吧？里边有这个脉冲还有 LED 我们就专家建议就是把22纳米紫外灯的这个团标加入到这个团标里面这个朱主任在下面要跟进做这件事儿。另外，我们也准备把这个标准这个立项和那个神经主任的牵头做一下这个相关的国家标准准备今年申请。
那么针对这个22纳米的过滤的原紫外的消毒设备呢，我们做了前后两个项目的研究。那么这是主要的实验结果。在室温环境下面，我们说工作第1分钟的时候，就1分钟内的话呢，可以杀灭大概 82.44% 的新冠病毒。那么5分钟的话呢，消杀率超过了90%。那么时间越长的话呢，病毒的消杀率就越高。那么在1小时的时候呢，可以达到 99.99%。
基本上可以认为呢，22纳米和24纳米呢，杀菌的效果是基本上是一致的。那么在封闭区域里面，就我们室内的建筑，像公共建筑里面呢，是最重要的是一个入口呢要把住，然后人流聚集的地方呢重点关注的。那么在入口呢提供体表消毒还有物表消毒，室内人群聚集的地方呢就是要做空气还有呢表面消毒。这个就是我们22纳米波可以大显身手的这个。所以总的看来呢，还是22纳米波的光源呢，用来做人机共存的杀菌呢是更合适的。有电梯间也应用，会议室、办公室、展陈室，还有呢食堂、快递点，还有医院里面。这些呢，就是我们学校在上半年疫情期间呢，就有比较大量的这个使用。
Built up to a steady state within the room. The pathogen continued to be injected for the final hour of the experiment, but at that point the lights were turned on. And what we can see at the current exposure limits for far ultraviolet light, this led to about a 92% reduction compared to when the lights were turned on. For the newly announced limits for exposure from the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, I think I got that correct, that leads to a greater than 99.9% reduction. And remember, the pathogen was still being injected into the room. So it's like running an experiment with, or having an infected person in the room continually for the 3 hours. And then the lights are turned off after hour 2.
As I mentioned, 6 to 12 air changes are recommended, but that has all to do with the infectiousness of the source. The greater the infectiousness, the greater number of air changes needed to produce the kind of protection we want. So essentially, more is better if it's feasible and affordable. It isn't feasible and affordable if you're moving bulk air and have to heat it and cool it and dehumidify it. Now, super spreaders account for most transmission of COVID. And now we're dealing with Omicron, which is more infectious than Delta, which is more infectious than the original strain. This concept of theoretical limits to how much ventilation or other forms of air disinfection can achieve is not new either. I published on this in 1991, saying that you don't get perfect air disinfection because of this target theory issue. You're always removing a fraction of what's left. You can't get to zero. Now we're talking about far UVC that Kenny and Ewan will be talking about in detail. And you see in some chamber studies that they'll talk about is that test organisms, you turn on the fixture and you get a plummet in the concentration of infectious particles, in this case, again, a bacteria.
So I'm a physicist, and so I wondered, could we take a physics-based approach, a different approach to this problem? And actually, that's where my physics background kicked into this story. So together with my physics colleagues, we realized there actually is a particular wavelength of ultraviolet light that should kill all bacteria, but should be safe for human exposure. And that wavelength is called far UVC light, and it's just the short wavelength part of the ultraviolet spectrum. So let's look to the future. So, I mean, I'm thrilled that we now have a completely new weapon, and actually I should say an inexpensive weapon, in our fight against superbugs. So, for example, I see far UVC lights in surgical theaters. I see far UVC lights in food preparation areas. And in terms of preventing the spread of viruses, I see far UVC lights in schools, preventing the spread of influenza, preventing the spread of measles. And I see far UVC lights in airports or airplanes, preventing the global spread of viruses like H1N1 virus.